The Soviet flag never came down in 1991. Instead, Moscow cut a desperate, secret deal. They gave 15 republics massive political freedom. They allowed private business and foreign cash. But Moscow kept the ultimate power. They controlled the military, the currency, and 20,000 nuclear warheads. They basically rebranded the entire empire overnight. Fast forward to the year 2026. The Cold War never ended. It just went digital. Today, the global internet is split completely in half. The Soviet web runs on state-controlled fiber optic cables. No Google, no Instagram, only state-approved platforms. And the space race? It never stopped. Both sides have permanent military bases on the moon. They spy on each other from lunar craters. Soldiers stare through high-tech binoculars across a heavily militarized lunar surface. Europe remains divided by a massive concrete wall. In Washington, the defense budget is 90% higher. Every American teenager still prepares for a potential draft. The economy looks very different too. The Soviets adopted a massive hybrid market system. Think of modern China, but spanning 11 time zones. They trade oil and gas with the West, but the threat of total destruction is always there. People do not buy smart home devices for convenience. They avoid them because the government monitors every single whisper. There is no active war, only a cold, heavy silence. We avoided the chaotic collapse of 1991, but we traded it for decades of constant anxiety. The red flag still flies high over Moscow, and the world is still holding its breath. Would you want to live in this version of 2026? The CIA predicted the Soviet Union would die in weeks. They were completely wrong. It is January 1992, and the red flag is still flying over Moscow. But the country is running out of food. Factories are shutting down. Inflation is so bad that your morning savings are worthless by dinner time. Moscow used to control every single price, every job, and every loaf of bread. Now that entire system is gone. Nobody knows what is coming next. To save the country, they created something called the Second Union. The republics got to run their own schools, police, and taxes. Private businesses were suddenly legal. But Moscow kept control over the military, the oil, and the nuclear launch codes. It was barely a country anymore. The biggest headache was Ukraine. Ukraine had 50 million people, massive farms, and thousands of Soviet nuclear weapons. Without Ukraine, the Union could survive geographically, but it could no longer claim to remain the same superpower. Kyiv demanded total control. They wanted their own parliament and their own laws. They wanted a guarantee that Russian troops would never cross their border. Negotiations almost fell apart. Then Washington got scared. The Americans did not want nuclear weapons floating around in a civil war. So, the US pressured both sides to sign a deal. Ukraine stayed in the Union, but only on paper. They kept their own economy, traded directly with Europe, and made Ukrainian their main language. But Moscow kept the nuclear keys. It was a tense, awkward truce. Meanwhile, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia walked away. Gorbachev let them go without firing a single shot. He said a union held together by tanks is not a union. The hardliners in the military were furious. They called him a traitor. But the Baltics were gone for good. By summer, the economic pain hit hard. Price controls vanished overnight. A loaf of bread that cost pennies in January now cost a week's wages. People watched their life savings disappear in days. For the first time in 70 years, unemployment was real. Protesters flooded the streets of Moscow. Some wanted the old communist system back. Others wanted fast Western reforms. Gorbachev knew he was running out of time. If people kept starving, the government would fall. He had to do the unthinkable. He asked the United States for money. This started a massive debate in Washington. For 40 years, the Soviets were America's biggest enemy. Now, they were begging for help. Some politicians wanted to let them collapse, but others warned of the danger. One senator summarized the dilemma. If we help them, we save our rival. If we do not, we get 15 unstable countries with thousands of nuclear missiles. The Americans chose the missiles. They sent financial advisors directly into the Kremlin to help rebuild the economy. At the same time, Soviet leaders looked at China. Beijing kept tight political control, but allowed free markets to grow. The Soviets decided to build a hybrid. They kept the big oil companies state-owned, but let citizens open restaurants and shops. Nobody knew what to call it. The first signs of stabilization appeared. Western investment entered major cities. Foreign supermarkets opened. New private businesses appeared. Restaurants, repair shops, small factories, import companies. Advertising filled streets that had once displayed political slogans. A Soviet veteran walked through a new shopping center. American music played. Western clothing filled windows. A fast food restaurant had a line stretching outside. He stared at everything. His grandson smiled. "Do you like it?" The old man shook his head. "But you do." His grandson nodded. The veteran smiled slightly. "Then that is enough," he said. By December 1992, against every single prediction, the Soviet Union was still there. It was poorer, smaller, and highly unstable, but it was alive. On Christmas night, Gorbachev told the nation that survival was not a victory. They had saved the country, but now they had to rebuild it. In Washington, intelligence agencies quietly changed their official forecasts. The Soviet Union was no longer expected to collapse. The Cold War did not end in 1991. It just entered a strange new phase. The Soviet Union did not collapse in 1991. It survived, but its massive empire was completely gone. Poland, Hungary, and Germany were already moving west. Moscow was terrified. The Americans saw a historic chance. They wanted to push NATO right to the Soviet border. The old Cold War was about communism versus capitalism, but by 1994, that fight was dead. McDonald's was open in Moscow. Soviet kids wore Levi's jeans. This new fight was about raw power and maps. The Soviet Union still had 12,000 nuclear weapons. Its military was still massive. Eastern Europe wanted protection fast. Poland remembered the horrors of 1939. They demanded NATO membership immediately. Moscow warned Washington to back off. The map of Europe was being redrawn. In 1995, both sides blinked. Neither wanted a nuclear war. The Soviet economy was too weak to fight, so they made a temporary deal. Eastern European states joined a special partnership. Poland hated this. A Polish minister warned the Americans. He said you cannot make Moscow happy and keep Poland safe. He was right. Then, the Balkans exploded. In our timeline, NATO stepped in alone. But in this timeline, the Soviets were too strong to ignore. They blocked the American plans in the United Nations. For the first time, US and Soviet interests collided directly. Eventually, they split the peacekeeping duties. 3,000 U.S. troops took one side. 3,000 Soviet troops took the other. It was incredibly tense, but it worked. By 1996, everything changed again. The Soviet economy started booming. Oil and gas prices went up. Billions of dollars flooded into Moscow. The capital transformed overnight. You had red flags flying next to Gucci stores. It was a weird hybrid superpower. Not communist, but not Western either. And they poured those billions back into their military. They did not build massive armies of unmotivated conscripts. They built smart tech. A secret Pentagon report warned that the U.S. advantage was gone. The arms race was back on. In 1997, the crisis hit a boiling point. Poland and Hungary demanded full NATO security. Soviet tanks mobilized on the border. U.S. fighter jets landed in Germany. For 3 weeks, Europe held its breath. Another compromise saved them. Poland got security guarantees but no foreign bases. Then came Kosovo in 1999. Superpowered jets flew in the same tight airspace. One nervous pilot could have started World War III. They survived, but trust was completely dead. On December 31st, 1999, the world celebrated the millennium. The Soviet flag still flew over the Kremlin. The US was not the single global boss. There were still two nuclear giants. Then came September 11th, 2001. Terrorists struck New York and Washington. The rivalry stopped instantly. Moscow shared critical intelligence on Afghanistan. Soviet bases in Central Asia became strategically important. American officials requested access. The answer surprised everyone. Moscow agreed, under strict conditions. For the first time, American military personnel operated from Soviet territory. A Soviet officer watched an American transport aircraft land. Beside him, an American officer stepped onto the runway. The two men looked at one another. 20 years earlier, they had trained to fight each other. Now, they shook hands. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the rivalry might finally end, that the Cold War could become history. But great power rivalry never dies. It just waits. And while America and Russia focused on Afghanistan, someone else was watching. Its economy was growing rapidly. Its factories were transforming global trade. Its military was modernizing. Its population exceeded 1 billion, and Beijing understood something that neither Washington nor Moscow wanted to admit. The 21st century would not belong to either of them. The Soviet Union had survived, but the world it once controlled had not. The Soviet Union survived the 90s. It sounds impossible, but it actually happened. The Berlin Wall fell. Germany united, but the red flag still flew over Moscow. This changed everything. By 2002, Europe faced a massive problem. Where did the West end? Where did the Soviet world begin? Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic moved west. Their militaries trained with NATO. Moscow knew the old empire was gone, but the Kremlin demanded one thing: a buffer zone. Washington said, absolutely not. Every country chooses its own path. The United States prepared to invade. Europe split down the middle. France and Germany said no. Britain said yes. Moscow saw a massive opportunity. They did not preach communism anymore. They positioned themselves as a shield against American power. The language was different, but the goal remained the same. Washington accused Moscow of trying to rebuild its global empire. Moscow accused Washington of acting like nobody else mattered. The post-9/11 cooperation was completely dead. By 2004, the European Union expanded. Poland and Hungary joined. The Baltic states wanted in too. Moscow did not care about trade. But then NATO knocked on the Baltic door. That changed everything. Estonia and Latvia bordered the Soviet Union directly. NATO troops could now sit on their front door. The Soviet parliament held an emergency meeting. One deputy warned that NATO was at the gates. War felt incredibly close. But diplomats found a loophole. The Baltics joined the West, but no permanent foreign bases were allowed. Moscow accepted it, barely. But the real nightmare was waiting further east. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. In this world, Ukraine was still inside the Soviet Federation, but they had massive autonomy. A new generation of Ukrainians looked west. They wanted to leave the Soviet system entirely. In 2005, Kiev exploded with protests. Blue European flags filled the streets. Students demanded a vote to leave. Moscow panicked. If Ukraine left, the entire Union would collapse. Soviet tanks prepared to move. But the Kremlin realized force would destroy their last bit of legitimacy. Instead, they negotiated. 6 weeks of intense diplomacy followed. The deal? Ukraine stayed, but got trade deals with Europe. The crisis ended, but everyone knew the fuse was still lit. Further south, Moldova followed a quieter path. Their economy connected with Romania and the West. Romanian culture expanded, but they stayed in the loose Soviet Federation to avoid a fight. Chisinau became a strange bridge. Soviet institutions still existed. Russian was widely spoken, but European money was everywhere. The border between East and West became impossible to define. Moscow still had one massive card to play: energy. Europe ran on Soviet gas. Every time political tension rose, gas prices mysteriously spiked. Europe realized they were hostage to the Kremlin. They started building pipelines to Africa and investing in green energy. It was not just about the climate. It was about survival. Then in 2008, the system nearly broke. Georgia voted to leave the Soviet Union. Moscow threatened immediate military action. The world held its breath. But then Ukraine made a shocking move. They issued a warning. If Soviet troops entered Georgia, Ukraine would leave immediately. Moldova joined the threat. The Kremlin was cornered. Fighting Georgia meant losing Ukraine. Moscow backed down. Georgia got a slow path to independence. It was a massive defeat for the Kremlin. By 2010, the map of Europe looked completely different. There was no physical wall, no barbed wire. Instead, 3 different Europes emerged: the integrated West, the Soviet core, and the dangerous gray zone in between: Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. These buffer states became the most contested lands on Earth. The new war was not fought with tanks. Not yet. It was fought with gas pipelines, money, and media. One diplomat was asked where the new Iron Curtain was. He pointed to the map between Brussels and Moscow. "There is no curtain," he said. "That is the problem." 3 nuclear superpowers lost control of their satellites instantly. It happened in 2019. For 17 minutes, the global defense grid went dead. No radar, no communications, no warnings. This was the result of a quiet decade. A decade where old rules of war vanished. For 50 years, the Cold War was simple. It was American tanks facing Soviet tanks. It was bombers waiting on runways. It was submarines hiding in deep oceans. But the 21st century changed everything. It created a battlefield without borders, a battlefield without soldiers. In 2010, the race moved above the sky. The United States built the most advanced satellite network on Earth. Every modern army depended on them for GPS and communication. But Moscow spent billions to build satellite killers. In 2011, they launched a secret missile. Minutes later, a target satellite vanished from radar screens. Washington screamed. Moscow just smiled. They called it strategic security. Space was officially a war zone, but they hunted for weaknesses in American military networks. Across the ocean, American cyber units did the exact same thing. In 2012, Eastern Europe felt the first shockwave. Government websites vanished overnight. Financial networks froze. It was a digital ghost attack. Nobody claimed responsibility, but the threat was real. NATO made a terrifying new rule. Next came the machines. By 2014, skies filled with unmanned aircraft. At first, they only watched the ground. Then, they carried missiles. Soon, military exercises changed completely. Instead of one expensive jet, commanders launched hundreds of tiny drones. Swarms of machines could jam radars, observe movements, and attack targets all at once. These cheap systems changed everything. They made human pilots look obsolete. But the real threat was artificial intelligence. AI started by reading satellite photos. It did the work of thousands of analysts in seconds. Then, AI took over drone navigation. It designed cyber defenses. It even started choosing military targets. Neither superpower wanted machines deciding who lives or dies. But neither wanted the other side to gain an advantage. So, development continued faster than ever. In 2015, world leaders met at the United Nations. They tried to ban killer robots. But the treaty collapsed. Why? Because everyone feared the other side would build them anyway. Then the physical weapons got faster. Much faster. Hypersonic missiles promised speeds 5 times faster than sound. Suddenly, a 10-minute warning became a 30-second warning. Reaction times vanished, and the game changed from a duel to a triangle. For 50 years, Washington only planned for Moscow. Now Beijing entered the race. China's military budget exploded. They built pipelines, railways, and naval bases. Moscow realized their old neighbor was becoming a massive threat. The Cold War was no longer a simple match. It was a three-way puzzle. Washington, Moscow, and Beijing were all watching each other. This brings us back to 2019, the day the screens went black. 17 minutes of absolute silence. No communication. No radar. American missile crews turned their launch keys. Soviet early warning systems went to maximum red alert. Chinese commanders watched their empty screens in silence. One nervous officer, one panic decision, and it would have ended humanity. When the satellites finally rebooted, everyone blamed a software glitch. They quickly built emergency hotlines. They banned AI from launching missiles. But the terror remained. Today, humans are still in control. But for how long? A veteran general was asked if he trusted machines. He said no, not because they make mistakes, but because machines do not know when to be afraid, and fear is the only thing keeping us alive. Everyone thought the Soviet Union died in 1991. They were wrong. It survived. It rebuilt. By 2020, the red flag still flew over Moscow. But the game had changed. It was no longer just America against the Soviets. A third giant had entered the room. China. For the first time in history, 3 superpowers were fighting for the exact same planet. Washington was panicking. The Pentagon called this the two-front century. American aircraft carriers ruled the oceans, but now they had to watch 2 massive rivals at the same time. American aircraft carriers ruled the oceans, but now they had to watch 2 massive rivals at the same time. The the Soviets in Europe, China in Asia. The Soviet Union of 2020 looked weirdly modern. You could buy Western shoes. You could start a private business. Young people traveled to Paris. But the Kremlin still controlled the big things: oil, weapons, nuclear tech, space. But the Kremlin still controlled the big things: oil, weapons, nuclear tech, space. It was a capitalist engine inside a communist shell. For the citizens, it wasn't about ideology anymore. It was about pride. But then, China did something sneaky. They walked right into the Soviet backyard. For decades, Central Asia belonged to Moscow. Countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Suddenly, Chinese money was everywhere. They built railways, pipelines, and roads. Beijing said it was just business. But Moscow knew better. A Soviet diplomat warned his bosses, "We spent 50 years watching America. China just walked in through our back door." In Kazakhstan, the fight got real. Chinese companies built roads. Soviet companies offered cheaper energy. China offered trade. Moscow offered military security. The local governments realized they could play both sides. For the first time, the Soviets were fighting for influence in their own home. Then came the real trigger point: Ukraine. By 2021, a whole generation of Ukrainians had grown up without Soviet memories. They wanted to look west, not east. They demanded a vote to leave the Soviet Union. The Kremlin couldn't stop it. The vote happened. The result was terrifyingly close. 52% voted to stay. 48% voted to leave. The Soviets won, but they didn't celebrate. They knew they were living on borrowed time. Then, a global pandemic hit. For a minute, everyone stopped fighting. Scientists in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing worked on vaccines. It looked like the world might actually unite. It didn't last. Soon, vaccines became weapons. America sent Western shots. Moscow made their own. Beijing shipped Chinese vaccines. You were choosing an alliance. By 2022, the battle moved to space. The second space race had started. America sent astronauts back to the moon. The Soviets built a lunar base. China landed gear at the South Pole. No one officially claimed land, but military maps already had lines drawn on them. They were looking for water ice and mining spots. Humanity went to space and immediately brought its old grudges with them. Back on Earth, the war was fought over something smaller than a fingernail: microchips. These tiny pieces of silicon run everything: missiles, cars, phones, and artificial intelligence. By 2024, the battle moved into artificial intelligence. Washington invested billions. Beijing invested billions. Moscow created a massive Soviet artificial intelligence directorate. They realized the next war wouldn't be won with nuclear bombs. It would be won with data. The nuclear arms race had required uranium. The AI arms race required data, chips, energy, and intelligence. The world had become more connected than ever, and more divided. American alliances dominated much of Europe and the Pacific. The Soviet Federation remained a vast Eurasian power. China controlled enormous economic networks across Asia and beyond. Smaller countries learned to balance: trade with China, security with America, energy with Moscow, technology from everyone. Inside a strategic analysis center, a giant digital map displayed the world. Blue represented the American alliance system. Red represented the Soviet sphere. Gold represented Chinese strategic partnerships. The Soviet Union never actually collapsed. It is January 1st, 2026. In our history, the red flag came down in 1991. 15 countries became independent. The Cold War ended, and America became the only global superpower. This is not the old communist system. There are private companies, foreign restaurants, and luxury brands. People get rich and travel abroad. But the state still owns the big things: energy, defense, space, and artificial intelligence. The party realized they had to change to survive. The political system is weird. It is a massive federation where republics have their own parliaments. Ukraine, Moldova, and Kazakhstan run their own schools and local laws. But Moscow still controls the nuclear weapons and foreign policy. Ukraine has its own parliament. Moldova has its own. Kazakhstan has its own. Critics call it an empire in disguise. Supporters call it the only reason the Union survived. Just 5 years ago, nearly half of Ukrainians voted to leave. The tension is always there. Older factory workers want to stay connected to Moscow. The youth want to join Europe. Every single election is a battle over whether to split. Further west, Moldova acts as a bridge. Romanian and Russian are spoken on the same streets. Moldovans work across the Soviet Union, but trade easily with Europe. It is complicated, but it makes them money. Because the Union survived, America never dominated the world alone. Every U.S. president since 1991 faced a rival nuclear superpower. The Pentagon has to watch two massive competitors now: Moscow and Beijing. The massive Soviet conscript army is gone. In 2026, their military is small, professional, and high-tech. They have hypersonic missiles, stealth jets, and drone swarms. There is no Berlin Wall today. The new Iron Curtain is digital. It is built out of microchips, software standards, and satellite networks. American systems run the West. Soviet systems run Eurasia. Chinese systems dominate developing markets. You cannot see this wall, but it divides the planet. Up there, you cannot see borders or alliances, just one fragile blue marble. But down on Earth, the danger is real. At 2:42 p.m., a Soviet early warning screen flashes red. A missile launch is detected in the North Atlantic. Sirens scream. Officers stare at conflicting data. One satellite says launch, another says clear. In Washington, U.S. systems detect a spike in Soviet military radio. American bases go to high alert. In Beijing, Chinese satellites watch both sides prepare. The world holds its breath. The hotline rings. Washington calls Moscow. Did you launch? Moscow says no. Did you? Washington says negative. Beijing joins the line to confirm they are clear too. 20 minutes later, they find the truth. A dead civilian satellite broke apart in orbit. The space junk tricked the software. The alert is canceled. The weapons stay quiet. Most people never know how close they came to the end. An officer in Moscow sighs and says, "That was close." But his commander points to the red phone on the desk. He says, "No, that phone is why it was not close." Talking saved the world. Night falls on Moscow. The streets are bright. People are eating out and taking photos. The Soviet Union survived another day. But it is a tense peace. 3 superpowers, 3 nuclear arsenals, 1 planet trying to survive a Cold War that never ended. The camera slowly moves above Moscow, then Europe, then Asia, then the entire planet. 3 lights appear: Washington, Moscow, Beijing. 3 superpowers, 3 enormous military systems, 3 nuclear arsenals, 3 competing visions of the future, and 1 planet trying to remain in balance. December 31st, 2026. Moscow is freezing. Snow is falling on Red Square. Thousands of people are taking photos under the holiday lights. But if you look up at the Kremlin, you see something impossible. A red flag is waving in the wind. The flag of the Soviet Union. In our timeline, that flag came down 35 years ago. It was over. But in this world, it never left. Go back to December 1991. The Soviet Union was bleeding. The economy was dead. Store shelves were empty. Republics wanted out. Everyone knew the superpower was finished. In our world, it collapsed on Christmas Day. But let's change one decision. What if Moscow didn't let it die? What if they built it again? What if they gave republics more freedom? The old communist system died, but the country survived. This one change rewrote 35 years of history. Without the Soviet collapse, America never got to run the world alone. Washington stayed incredibly powerful, but they were never truly comfortable. Every US president still had to watch Moscow. Every NATO strategy still had to consider the Soviet military. Every European security decision still carried the shadow of the Cold War. Europe changed. Germany remained the diplomatic center between East and West. Poland moved firmly toward NATO. The Baltic states escaped the Soviet Federation. But the countries farther east followed another path. Ukraine remained inside the Union with extraordinary autonomy. Moldova became a bridge between Moscow and Europe. Georgia moved toward possible independence. Capitalism existed. Private companies existed. Foreign investment existed. People traveled. Western products filled shops. Technology transformed everyday life. But the government still controlled the strategic foundations of the state: energy, defense, space, nuclear weapons, infrastructure, artificial intelligence. The Soviet Union survived not by preserving everything it once was, but by abandoning much of what had created it. Perhaps that was the greatest irony. Then another giant rose. For decades, Washington and Moscow had watched each other. But China transformed the balance. Factories became technology centers. Technology became military power. Economic influence spread across continents. By the 2020s, the world no longer had two superpowers. It had three: Washington, Moscow, Beijing. The Cold War had become something even more complicated. Perhaps this world would be safer. No single country could dominate everything. Every major decision required compromise. But balance has another side. More superpowers mean more nuclear arsenals, more competing alliances, more military calculations, more opportunities for misunderstanding. One false radar signal, one cyber attack, one satellite failure, one mistake could place millions of lives inside a decision measured in minutes. Late evening, Moscow. Inside a history museum, a small exhibition shows the year 1991. Old newspapers, television recordings, political documents, photographs of demonstrations. In the center, behind glass, there is something unusual. A Soviet flag, folded carefully. A small label beneath it reads, "Flag prepared for the lowering ceremony, December 1991. But the ceremony never happened. A teenage boy looks at the flag. Beside him, his grandfather waits. The boy asks, "They were really going to lower it?"